Hello, I'm Logan Phillips and welcome to my vlog, or as we like to call it, the VLOGAN. This is a vlog dedicated to people with special needs and those who love them. I'm lucky enough to be sitting here today with Gary Tonks, who is the president and CEO of the ARC of Ohio. Gary started in the 70s as a direct care provider to individuals with disabilities. So he's started with direct care and now is president and CEO of I think Ohio's largest advocacy organization. So Gary, thanks again for being here. Can you tell people what the ARC is all about?
Okay, well, we've been around since 1950. We were originally founded by families who wanted something beyond a state institution for their kids. The thought of the ARC was conceived in Columbus, Ohio in the spring of 1950. There had been parent groups springing up since the 1930s. In fact, the groups in Cleveland and Cincinnati were some of the first to form, where parents had begun getting together saying there has to be something else. We've had for decades, over 100 years, an organization of professionals now known as the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. They've had a number of names, some using the R word that we don't use anymore. Right. But in the spring of 1950, they had their annual conference in Columbus, Ohio, and they had heard about, these were usually superintendents of the large state institutions. They were gathering for their national convention and had a tract for parents. They had thought, oh, wow, we're seeing all of these parent groups springing up all over the country. We'll have a tract specifically for parents of children with intellectual disabilities. Those parents in that tract decided we need something of our own. So by the fall of 1950, with actually our Cincinnati, what became our Cincinnati chapter, founded what was then the Association for Retarded Children. It was made up of parents who, for example, one of our founders had worked on the Manhattan Project during the World War II.
Wow.
And she and her husband had a child with a disability. So they were physicians, physicists, moms and dads, and they created the organization. Through the 50s and 60s, because of who they were, they had major connections. Mm-hmm. So, by the time President Kennedy came into office in the early 1960s, our national convention was in Washington, D.C., and President Kennedy, the month before he was assassinated, came to the ARC conference in Washington. But wow. By then they had let him know, and because he had a sister with a disability, they connected to Hubert Humphrey, who had a relative with a disability. They connected to Barbara Streisand, who had a sister with a disability. We were the organization that before it was like Pride Week, it was, I've got a kid with a disability, and by the way, he's got blue eyes. Mm-hmm. We were that organization that not only were created to find options, but to promote that disability is normal. Mm-hmm. And we became politically active. There were chapters throughout the country. We're all independently incorporated, but we all have a common mission of when I started, it was, quote, promote the general welfare, unquote, and you figure out how to do that in Mansfield. And we'll figure out how to do that in Indianapolis. Mm-hmm. But there were no services other than those state institutions for the first few decades. And in fact, in the 1950s, 60s, and into the mid-70s, if you had a child with a disability, a school system could legally say, I'm sorry, we can't educate your child, send them home. So parents began organizing the first schools for kids with disabilities. And because the ARC had connections to Star Power, some of your listeners are not going to recognize the name Roy Rogers and Dell Evans. Do you recognize that name?
I absolutely do.
So Roy Rogers and Dell Evans had a little girl with Down syndrome.
Yeah, and his horse Trigger, if I remember.
Absolutely, Trigger, yeah. And all of that. So they were major movie stars in the 1950s. And sadly, their daughter passed away at a young age. And Dell Evans wrote a book called Angel Unaware. if you had a child with a disability, the general feeling was you must have done something wrong. It's your fault. God may be punishing you. But Dale Evans wrote a book that, no, it's not true at all that you did something wrong. You did something right because your child is basically God's angel on earth, and he has blessed you with a child with a disability. It's a tiny little book. If anyone wants to read it.
Well, I certainly am.
We've got a copy. It's a great little book. Sad because it ends with the death of their child, but at the beginning, she donated the proceeds from that book to start a new organization, which happened to be the ARC.
Wow.
We're still getting proceeds on a national level from that book that was published in the 50s, but it began to turn the corner. I was blessed, having started over 40 years ago, to meet many of our founders. And they told me they would literally knock on doors of people they knew who had children with disabilities. And the parent would stand at the door and say, no, I don't know anyone with a disability. Mm-hmm. But they did things like that, and they organized. So when it proceeded into, okay, I'm going to make friends with the Kennedys and all the power brokers, and I'm going to quietly push for a right for my child to go to school. And when pushing and socializing doesn't work, I'm going to sue. So by the 1970s, the ARC of Pennsylvania sued the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, saying that, and they went back. Are you an attorney?
I am, yes.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
So you've heard of Brown versus the Board of Education.
Absolutely.
In the 1950s, the Supreme Court ruled that separate is not equal for people of color. So in the 1970s, the ARC sued, ended up in the Supreme Court saying, if separate is not equal for people of color, neither is it equal for people with disabilities. So special education was created by parents associated with the ARCs, filing a lawsuit that gained the right to an education for children with disabilities, a free and appropriate public education. And thus we have special ed. The ARC wrote most of the law.
Wow.
And the guy that helped actually write the law became our executive director in the late 70s and 80s and into the 90s, Al Abison. So we did that. In Ohio specifically, we started the first schools. Parents started the first schools. And in honor of Roy Rogers and Dale Evans, one of the very first schools in Ohio is in Lima, Ohio, and it's called the Robin Rogers School. Robin was their daughter.
Yeah.
So it's the ARC of Allen County still has their offices in what was the school named after Robin Rogers. So there is a tight connection.
Yes.
So we established special education. In Ohio, those schools, and they were schools all over the state of Ohio, sometimes in church basements, wherever. So we founded all these schools, and these parents' kids grew up. And even though they had a right to an education and were leaning in that direction in the 60s, there weren't adult services. So by 1967, the ARC was instrumental in creating county boards of developmental disabilities. And they got, it's called House Bill 169. This is prior to interstates. Mm-hmm. They came to Columbus and Mass, got a bill passed to create what we know now as our county boards. So they were involved in that. By the 1990s, they were also instrumental in creating the Americans with Disabilities Act. Mm-hmm. But we started as support groups around dining room tables. My journey started in the mid-70s, and really prior. I grew up with a cousin with cerebral palsy. I thought I would be a 5th grade elementary ed school teacher. And the first week on campus, I began dating a special ed major. And she said, oh, you know, I belong to this group called Youth Arc, and we're hosting a dance. And we need guys to dance with the ladies who come with disabilities. I had such a great time that I started volunteering for the ARC the week I turned 18. And we had a Boy Scout program. And I volunteered at a Boy Scouts program at an institution. Graduated, I did that for 4 years, graduated, got a job teaching, and quit within a semester. The summer after graduation, I worked in a group home. Left when I got a teaching job, lasted a semester because I can't handle 4 walls. Love teaching, but those 4 walls. Went back to doing direct service for an ARC, who also established all the community programs, and got promoted very quickly. And so I've worked for the ARC as a direct service staff person, a local executive director, and a state director in Alabama, California, and Ohio. Operating under that philosophy originally of promoting the general welfare. And I've been with the ARC of Ohio now for almost 25 years. We still see ourselves as the primary civil rights advocate for children and adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities.
So what I hear you saying is that people who are living in this world right now and have a child with developmental disability, or they're a person with a disability, that the ARC is the reason that there are so many opportunities right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wonderful.
And even though we're all separately incorporated, not a week goes by that we don't get a call from someone who has a relative in Indiana or Florida or Alaska, and I can call my peers in those states who will help.
Yeah.
Or if last week we had a parent who we had helped with educational advocacy move from Canton to Indianapolis. And she didn't know where anything was. And we called our counterparts in Indiana and they called her. And I always say, if I broke down in the middle of the country, I probably would call the local ARC before I called the AAA.
Got it. Got it.
You know, it's a family of families.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I noticed on your website that it talks about IDD, intellectual and developmental disabilities.
Right.
Can you talk about why that, why you use that nomenclature as opposed, we see so many times just developmental disabilities.
Right. Well, not everyone with an intellectual disability. So you have to understand, and I'm going to use the R word. Okay. We started originally as the Association for Retarded Children. Our kids grew up. We became the Association for Retarded Citizens. And then we were the first organization to take out the R word. Mm-hmm. But not everyone with an intellectual disability has a developmental disability. We don't use IQs as much as we used to, but a developmental disability means that you developed your disability before the age of 22 and you have deficits in several areas. An intellectual disability might mean that, so if we were to use IQs, 100 is average. I might have an IQ of 85 or 90. Yeah, I just didn't do really well in school. We still think we believe that we're still the advocates for those people who maybe don't fit the definition of developmental disability, are not going to be qualified for county boards services. But because of my intellectual disability, I may be able to qualify for SSI or Medicaid, because while I don't function at a level that's going to require county board of DD services, I don't function at a level where I could get a full-time job. 1 in 10 families is affected by intellectual disability that may also be DD. But we didn't want to lose that. So we were one of the organizations that remained silent when county boards took out the word MR, mental retardation, because we still believed that we had a mission to represent those people as well.
And does that mean then that individuals who might have an intellectual disability that's not developmental, dementia or TBI, they are also can be assisted by folks at the ARC?
Not technically, but what we do is we try to help as much as possible. With dementia, we would refer to the Area Agency on Aging or the Alzheimer's Association. With TBI, we work with the Department of Medicaid. So actually, I helped someone just yesterday. Was in a motorcycle accident on his 22nd birthday.
Mm-hmm.
To be qualified for county services, you have to have your disability before the age of 22. He functions exactly the same as his counterpart who was injured at the age of 20. But he doesn't qualify for DD services, so we were able to hook him up with something called the home care waiver through the Department of Medicaid that is able to help him. He already was receiving SSI and Medicaid, but he needed more help.
I know that you've testified before the Ohio legislature, and I think it was in 2019 you testified about the pay increase for direct supports. What are the issues facing the ARC and by extension people with IDD in the community?
The salaries of our direct care is at the top. Turnover in our system is over 55%. And it's not just direct care. It's the case management system, middle management. Traditional residential programs are most severely harmed, whether that's in a waiver setting or what's called an intermediate care facility. We pay deplorable salaries. I wrote an op-ed that was recently published in the Canton Repository and the Dispatch here in Columbus. They're not paid. They've never been paid well. It was deplorable when I did it over 40 years ago, and it's still bad. We depopulated our state facilities, who are state unionized with good state benefits and fairly good salaries. They're not even paid what they should be paid, but we sold the community as a cheaper alternative. We were able to sell it to the legislature and the public as less expensive. Well, we knew it was better quality of life. We went from tens of thousands of people in Ohio's institutions to, I don't know, it's under 1,000 now.
Right.
But we sold it as cheap. And it's in the Medicaid system, which is essentially our welfare system. So we're low paid. So that's a major initiative. It took us a long time to get the legislature to approve a 4% increase in provider rates that allows our providers to pay more. But it allows providers to pay more, but it doesn't mandate providers to pay more.
Yeah, right.
So we work closely with the County Board Association, and the ARC and the county boards have insisted that there be a survey of all agency providers of what did you do with the money. We only know it's only 4%, and we know some of you use that to keep the lights on, but we also know that some of you, may not have passed it on. So there is a survey now going on that will be made public of what did agencies do with the money. It's helping direct care, helping direct care, helping direct care. That's the big legislative push right now, and always help us provide more Medicaid waivers to people with disabilities. We're about the only state that has local levies. And if you grow up in Ohio, you think of levies as pretty normal. Most states don't have levies to raise funds to support people with disabilities. Remembering that our county board started as schools, and also remember that the Ohio Supreme Court declared our school funding unconstitutional 25 years ago. Our county boards of DD adopted the school funding formula. So every county is different in the levies they raise to support people with developmental disabilities. So keep that in mind. And then also keep in mind that waivers are a partnership with the federal government. In every other state, our state on a normal day is waivers are 60% federally funded, 40% state. Because of the pandemic, it's now 70-30. But on a regular day, 60% from the feds, 40% from the state. But in Ohio, most of that 40% match comes from the county, not the state.
Mm-hmm.
And that still makes it inequitable, even though we have a promise with the federal government, everyone in Ohio has equal access to the waivers. The reality is yes and no.
Mm-hmm.
So while we are after the legislature all the time to provide more funding, in most cases, the waivers are funded locally by county boards. This 4% we got in January is state funded.
Okay.
And yeah, so that it becomes complicated. And because of term limits, our legislators don't always understand how that works.
Sure.
The other thing to keep in mind is we've got our waivers, and most of the people listening to this will have or will want a Medicaid waivers.
Absolutely.
We have thousands of Ohioans with disabilities living in what are called intermediate care facilities. They're also Medicaid funded, but the 40% match for an intermediate care facility comes from the state treasury, not from the county.
If a person is listening to this and they're wondering about two things. First, how is the ARC funded? Which then leads into the next section is how can someone help? I noticed you said that you volunteered with the ARC back in the 60s and 70s. What could somebody do who says, hey, I want to help the ARC because of what they do?
And it's evolved over the years. There are ARCs all over the country. Almost all of the nonprofits who support people with disabilities in Ohio were founded by parents affiliated with the ARC, or the ARC had a practice of, let's create a provider agency and then spin it off. That's pretty standard in Ohio. In the rest of the country, not all, but in most of the rest of the country, the ARC created all the programs, all the group homes, the workshops, and they didn't spin them off. They kept them. The ARC of New York is a multi-billion-dollar corporation. So they're the major service provider. New Jersey is the major service provider. Pennsylvania is a mix of advocacy organizations and providers, as is Indiana. Michigan, the state up north, and Ohio are more similar. We had adopted a philosophy for most of our 70 years that we were going to be the advocates. We were going to be pure, and we were going to be funded by our local chapters. Our local chapters pay a membership affiliation fee, sort of like a franchise fee.
Sure.
You pay it to the ARC of the Ohio and the ARC of the United States to support the mission, support our legislative activity. And what happened was our ARCs began to die, and they began to die for a number of reasons. Some of them aged out. Our founders were so incredible, they didn't bring along the next generation.
Right.
Most of the chapters of the ARC were also funded by United Way. United Way doesn't fund people with disabilities anymore. We have one chapter, the chapter in Allen County that still receives United Way dollars. We didn't fit their outcomes. The finances that we were receiving through our local chapters began to dry up. So the ARC went through a strategic planning process. It began about 20 years ago, culminated in our most recent strategic plan where we talked to families and we said, what do you want from us? And they said, we want more than your advocacy. We want something we can touch. We want something we can see. And you remember those workshops and group homes you created? We don't see that in the future for our kids anymore. So they challenged us with doing something different. So 5 years ago, the ARC had a $250,000 budget, the ARC of Ohio. We had a bunch of local, independent, local chapters who were all struggling from age and a lack of traditional financing. We offered our chapters an opportunity to merge with us. and we adopted a program called One Arc in Ohio. So all but, I think, 4 chapters have now merged. We actually assumed them. So we lowered our administrative costs, and I wrote a number of grants to create something else. So we created a couple programs. One was assistive technology. The state and the county didn't understand that, if you probably ever worked with someone with cerebral palsy, for years, if they needed a communication device, the state would pay for a $12,000 big communication device that I sat on my lap and I could bill Medicaid, but they wouldn't pay for a $500 iPad with a free app.
Right.
We got them to agree to do that, and we got the waivers to agree to pay for all of that. But no one was buying iPads. So we got certified as an assistive technology provider, underwritten by the Knights of Columbus, which is a longtime partner.
Okay.
So we generated revenue from that. And then I wrote a grant to create something called the Family Choice Program, where if you have a waiver or local funding and you want to hire someone that you've known, that has known your child for a long time, the Arc of Ohio became a certified agency provider, and we work with families to hire within your own network. We had many complaints that,
sure,
I don't want this person who I don't know coming into my home. So we have a home-based service called Family Choice. We're now serving 200 families, and it's growing rapidly. So the Arc of Ohio generates a great deal of funding now that we use for advocacy by providing services through waivers. We've grown from $250,000 budget to a $6 million budget in a few years, and have actually had to halt the growth. The program is so popular because only someone you know enters your home, and we allow families to retain hire and fire authority.
How would somebody learn more about the ARC? And then if they want to help the ARC, how would they do that?
They can call me personally. My number's on the website at 614-487-4720. They can connect through our website. They can also connect through our Facebook page. A great way to help is, I want to help organize families in my area. I've been meeting with families in dining rooms, McDonald's, Panera's, and we're doing that because of our connections and our resources. The directors of the various departments, like Medicaid and DD especially, they will go out and meet with families face-to-face, or we do a Zoom session where families have direct access to the policymakers. So you can get involved any of that way, and we'd love to have you.
That's great. Well, again, everyone, we've been talking with Gary Tonks, President and CEO of the ARC of Ohio. You can hear his phone ringing. Gary's got to get to fires that need to be put out and get to helping people with IDD. So Gary, thanks so much.
Thanks, Logan.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of VLOGAN. Please like, share, and subscribe to the RRPG channel so you can stay up to date with some of the latest news in the disability community.